Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Will Horton, and I'm happy to bring you to Module 1 of Fast Addiction Recovery 2.0, updated since the last time I did it, because information keeps changing and growing, so it's time to update it. So, again, I'm Dr. Will Horton. I'm a psychologist, now called drug counselor, probably the world's leading practical NLP trainer. I'm an expert in addiction recovery. Been doing that for over 30 years. In fact, it's how I got into this field. Um, Quick little background about me is it was an addiction that brought me into this part of the world. I had an addiction. It was alcohol. It took away a couple of nice careers, the military, and then my acting career. Also several relationships, and goes on and on. Anyway, when I first got the opportunity to sober up, I would got some treatment. I started to sober up. When that happened, I fell in love with hypnosis and NLP, and it took me down a different path. I've stayed active in recovery in a 12-step program, which we'll get to later. They seem to work for me. I do admit it's not the only way, but I've seen the field in an interesting light in the last 30 plus years. And so, and also as a psychologist, researcher, and NLP and hypnosis person, I look at things much differently, and that's what this is all about today. Anyway, just an overview. Again, I always start with the scope of the problem. Most alcohol is drank by a small percentage who do drink. We're going to get to this later. Not everybody drinks. Not every adult drinks. There's a lot of reasons: health, vitality. People just choose not to drink. Religious reasons, whatever. But of the people that drink, the small percentage drink most of the alcohol. So let's say if it's 10 or 15% of the people that drink about 70% of the alcohol. What's that mean? That means there's a small percentage that drink more. Most people don't drink that much, right? So so this brings in some other things when you look at it. So if you are a marketer, if you're a business person and you own a brewery or a winery or a distillery, uh, who's a better customer? A guy that buys a six pack every, 2, 3 months, maybe has a beer every once in a while, one beer a week at the football game during season, or the guy that's drinking a case of beer a day? Well, let's be honest, it's the guy drinking a case of beer a day. Same with everything else. So most people don't have a problem, but the small percentage that do have a big problem. And this is true about other drugs. And then there's social norms about partying, especially in the West, and it's kind of gone worldwide, that there's a peer pressure to drink or to use, depending on where you're at, right? And it seems abnormal not to, especially if you're in that crowd. And then you start to think. So there's a big scope that we'll be dealing with. But of course, we're dealing with the people that have a problem. So who needs help? Well, people that have a loss of control, that they have abnormal behaviors when they drink, and these are things like using when not intending, drinking when they don't intend to, drinking more or using more than intended. Just worked with somebody. It was about marijuana, and they use when they not intended to, and then they only mean to smoke a little bit, take the edge off, as they said. And the next thing you know, they're stoned. So that means it's a problem, right? Because if you didn't have a problem, A, you wouldn't use when you didn't want to, and B, if you're only going to do this, you only do that, and people do that all the time. They only going to have a beer. That's all they have, right? But it's the people that can't stop. And then it also goes into like thinking about it when they're not doing it. So they're giving it space in their brain. And then, of course, using in spite of negative consequences. Your spouse, your boss, somebody tells you shouldn't be doing it, and you're doing it. That's a major red factor, right? Something needs help. So, and there's kind of a U curve, if there will, about people that do this. And this is about a family illness, right? But, you could read this later. It's in your manual, But it kind of goes down a path. Now, most people, if they get down here, where you get into this area where your spouse starts complaining about the drinking or the drugging or whatever it is. Well, if you don't have a problem, you'll just quit. You'll just quit, right? And you won't go down this whole path. But those that continue down the path are the ones that we have a tendency to work with. Now, we have to remember too, when you're looking at this, most addicts, alcoholics, are highly functional. You know, one of the things we have to work with when people come see us is the denial someone gets that I can't be an alcoholic or an addict. I still have a job. I still do this. I still do that. That can be that last defense mechanism, right? So, you know, just something to think about that not everybody becomes a skid row drunk, ends up in jail or prison. You know, many people hit a level where they can, you know, they control it. It's not unusual to see, especially with the drug alcohol, they end up getting in a position where they can continue. You know, I knew a guy, I worked with his spouse more, but, you know, he started a business and got pretty successful, and it was the business that I would say killed him because his big defense was, I run a 7-figure business. Well, after it really got going, actually, the more they got him out of the business, the better it ran, you know, and but that was his defense mechanism. So you get things like that, right? So now when we get into this whole thing about addictions and treating people, is it nature or nurture? You know, there's an ongoing dispute in the treatment psychological community whether addiction is a genetic issue or a psychological issue. So is it nature, is it nurture? Now some new thoughts are emerging that will help us in how we treat and use this abuse or dependence criteria, if you will. So what about nature? You know, there is evidence that people who suffer from addictions, especially alcoholism, have a genetic predisposition to the disease, right? And there could be a genetic link. And they're finding out more and more. It's basically how your brain reacts, and we're going to get into that in this module, right? However, this wouldn't explain why some children of alcoholics and other members of subgroups like this do not become alcoholics. Or you get a, you know, but again, that could be genetic, right? But there's some studies even with identical twins, interesting things where one goes down the substance abuse path, the other does not. So there's probably, it's in the middle, right? But there's new information coming to light. So what about nurture? This is the one that would mainly say that addiction or this kind of stuff is a learned behavior. And this could be why children of alcoholics, for instance, are more predisposed to become alcoholics, even if you took the genetic thing out. Well, they see that alcohol or the drug addiction is a stress response. It's the only time you see mom or dad having fun, yada, yada, yada. Well, then it's a learned, nurturing thing that this is correct, right? It's also you get into subgroups, some societies, if you will, where this is the normal behavior, right? So it's kind of nurtured in, right? And then lately, there's more information about it being a stress response. And this new info points that substance abuse is a stress reaction, right? This kind of makes sense when it explains people who abuse, drink alcoholically, use drugs badly, abuse them for sometimes even prolonged periods, then just stop. You know, they seem to be able to return to normal. Now, when this happens, it shakes the traditional models to the core. You know, the traditional model says, you're a cucumber, and once you become a pickle, you'll never become a cucumber again, right? But it seems like, when you step back and step out of the world and begin to challenge it, this is not always true. There are people that, we're going to get into this, that use it as a stress response, and then they go back to normal, right? And then there are people that says it's more of a behavior. Addiction is a behavior. That substance abuse does not occur in a vacuum. This kind of goes in with the stress response. They do specific behavior in specific places. This kind of explains the people that drink or they use at home and not in public, or reverse. They only drink when they're out. They never drink at home, right? Or the people that only drink for specific reasons. This could also go back to the stress response, right? They're angry, they're stressful, they're depressed. If everything else, then they don't. So it could be a behavior, And then we add in the mindscape or the brain-based issue. There's a neurotransmitter or brain chemicals that are in play with substance abuse. It has to do with dopamine and serotonin. Basically, these neurotransmitters are out of balance. And what you're doing is you're self-medicating to seek biobalance using substances. And if your brain fits a certain profile, this becomes paramount. We're going to show you a new model in this module later on that kind of explains this in a nutshell, right? But here are the current treatments. There's cognitive behavioral therapy model, there's the disease model where we talk about alcoholism as a disease. This is the current one. And even in the disease model, they'll use probably CBT or something like that to treat it. There's the adaptive model. That's where they're adapting to certain things. That's why they're using or abusing the substances. And then there's the harm risk reduction model. And this one basically says that everything we do is harmful or risky, and we do things to reduce the risk, like driving a car. That's why you have to wear a seatbelt. There's speed limits, things like that. So people are going to drink. They are going to use. Let's remove the risks, right? Which kind of makes sense when you've got all your faculties. I won't drink and drive. That's how I get in trouble. Well, that's easy to say till you had 6 beers, but it's out there and people try to do it. There's the medical model. They're always looking for the magic bullet, a pill, a potion, something that'll just cure alcoholism or drug addiction, right? Then there's the 12-step model, which is the predominant model. And even people with CBT will refer people to 12-step models. There's the NLP model, which I'm working on, that I approach, right, which kind of takes in a little bit of everything. And it takes in the brain-based model, that it's a brain-based issue with the neurotransmitters and things like that. And the brain-based model kind of goes into the medical model, right? But basically, all treatments seem to be all or nothing. Most treatments are all in. In other words, once you cross a certain line, you can never go backwards. So do they work? Does risk reduction work? Well, the evidence is mixed, because how are you going to follow it? That's the biggest thing, right? But there's always the examples in the real world, There's a lot of research going on around right now, or I've read some current stuff, pro and con about 12 steps. Well, first of all, it's called an anonymous program, so you're not going to gather clean information in an anonymous program, right? Also, people sober up in AA, and they may be sober a decade, and you don't know if they're going or not, but they may still be tied to the program. I mean, it's a murky field because, once you sober up, if you're an addict, if you get clean and sober, you may not want to really disclose that. You might disclose it at an AA meeting or with friends or family, but you're not going to tell it to the world because there's still a lot of negative connotations. So, but most of you're either in box A or box B. But this is interesting because there's a split now. We need to rethink our approach. And the big question is, which approach? All in for addictions or risk reduction? Right? Something that is currently going on out there that we need to look at because we fit in a different paradox. People that will come to a hypnotist or an NLPer or even just outside therapy that doesn't want to go into like an inpatient treatment program. They're looking for a different answer. So as we think about that, here's what I mean about the decision. I link it with the Happy Rat study. And what the Happy Rat study is, in the 70s, there was a commercial where you had a rat in a cage, and had water, food, and then a little water bottle with cocaine in it. It was the first one. And it said, there is one drug, big, voiceover shows this rat in there drinking this stuff. There's one drug that when given, this animal will ignore food, water, everything. Then you put another rat next to it in another cage, even sex, and it will do this drug till it dies. And it's kind of where the whole zero tolerance, the gateway drug crap came out. All this stuff, right? Basically, and they kind of repeated the study with other drugs. Well, so boom, this justifies what we're doing, right? Never did, by the way, just my own social comment, never did justify punishing the abuser and not the people pushing the abuse more. But anyway, fine. Well, this was out there. It's still out there. It's still the mindset. In fact, there's people still talking about, they're loosening certain things, marijuana in the United States. There's people screaming, it's horrible. These people, whatever. Well, there's 3 things, and one's not up there, right? there's the Happy Rat study, there's the Vietnam vet experience, right? And then there's um, and even alcohol throughout history, right? Well, the Vietnam vet we must talk about. At the height of the Vietnam War, unlike the current wars, the veterans weren't embraced by society, and so it was bad, right? So a lot of soldiers in their stress reaction while they were over there drank a lot, alcoholically, used heroin, smoked too much dope. They did huge addictions, right? And so, of course, we were gearing up for this huge, huge problem when the vets came back. And, when they first got back, yes, for the first 6 months, there's that whole reintegration process, or it might be a little longer. But especially with heroin and even the alcoholism, it never materialized. It did for a certain subset. Those are the ones we hear about. But most people reacclimated quite well. I think from casual studies that when you looked at that, it kind of, when the numbers were equalized, because World War II had many more veterans, it was the same thing. Guys came back from that war, the small subset, around 10% or so, a little bit less, developed problems with it. The rest, they may have drank some when they first came back to this, but most got back to normal. And this kind of goes back to the Happy Rat study. There's a psychologist. What he did is he looked at that study again, and he said there's something wrong here. First of all, the rat's in a cage with nothing to do but get high, right? And, rats are quite intelligent. Any of us that's ever, had to deal with rats, here in Florida we get fruit rats. They're smart little buggers. They're cunning. They're social. They like groups. They get their little rat groups, right? And so, he took the rat out. Got the rat hooked on cocaine, right? Took the rat out of the cage where he was isolated, miserable, stressed out, and he was stressed out. And they put the rat in a cage with other rats. And there were things to do, food, different kinds of food, and also other rats to hang out with, things to do, things like that. Great. There was also cocaine available. But guess what? Most of the rats that they pulled out did not go back to the cocaine, right? They went and became happy rats. And when they got to be happy rats, they didn't return to the abuse. It didn't go with the other thing, right? About this drug is so tentacles in you, it will kill you. I'm not sure if any of the rats, a small subsection, did keep going, but no, just like going back to a Vietnam vet experience. And what's interesting, we're seeing that again with the current soldiers coming back, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines coming back from, Iraq and Afghanistan, where, they may be, when they first come back, there's a lot going on. And if you look at it from a neurochemical standpoint, there's the adrenaline drop, there's, the stressors aren't there and you can become addicted to the stress. There's, not feeling normal, yada, yada, yada. So they drink, they drug, they do too much when they first come back. But then they start to level out. In fact, I was just in a class, had nothing to do with this. A guy was talking about, he came back from his second tour and was drinking alcoholically, blackouts, didn't know what was going on, lost a couple jobs. And then one day he said, I don't want to do this anymore. What do I really want to do with my life? And he started taking, it was an acting class, by the way. So he started taking acting classes. He started hanging out with different people. He confronted his family of origin, which there was always some clash there. And, people ask him, you drink now? He goes, not really. Every once in a while he might have a beer. Wow, this goes against a lot of things. But he's moved out of that experience. So, but the major question of the statement is for us to decide if the person fits the categories, they must get clean long enough to get a baseline. In other words, once they're stable, do they relapse, right? Do they use when the stressors are gone? And for this to happen, first I have to talk about what one guy calls it the boxes. And basically, it's kind of a continuum. When you're young, you have no experience with alcohol or drugs, right? Unless you were born an addict, with your mother. Excuse me, there's a misprint there. There's the experimentation phase. It might happen when you're a teenager, might happen in college, It might happen in the military, but you're going to experiment. This is natural, especially in the Western world, because it's there, right? You're going to experiment with it. Now, most people begin casual use because alcohol, especially, and other drugs, it is a social thing usually, and it works, right? Great. So now most people are going to stay here. Now, you may have periods of, you go into the next box, you may have periods of heavy use, but you self-correct. You get drunk at a wedding or a party and stop when there's negative consequences. You see somebody go off to college, they're a party animal. They get out of college, they change. And you hear, there's movies like that. You'll see it's like, you've changed. No, this idiot's still like this party animal. And, they're still living Animal House. Everybody else know they get a life. They become normal, right? They may have a lot of the criteria, if you will, for substance abuse, but it's more as a stress reaction, because what that means, they'll self-correct once corrected, and they won't abuse. They get drunk really bad at a party or something, and there's negative consequences. They get in fights. They're in trouble. They're never going to do that again. This would explain somebody gets one DUI, and they will never ever get drunk and drive again, right? As opposed to someone that crosses a certain line, they're going to go back. And this goes to the last box. Now, there's some people, they may move into this substance abuse. They go to a divorce. They lose a job. Someone close to them dies. They're drinking. They're drugging too much, right? But then they self-correct. Somewhere along there, they work it out and they self-correct. They return to. They don't return to abuse. They might go back to normal. In fact, against what a lot of treatments say, they could go back up here to casual use, right? But if you're the type where your brain gets hijacked, addiction, maybe that 10%, 8%, whatever the number is, there's some kind of genetic thing that your brain gets hijacked. In other words, you can't reset your neurochemicals. Your brain gets hijacked, right? If this happens, you're screwed, right? Because you're going to stay in this addiction. It doesn't matter. You lose your job, you're still drinking. You get a DUI, you're drinking the day you get out of jail, and driving. You're doing everything like, my God, what is wrong with you? There is something wrong with you. You can't stop. Your brain has been hijacked. Not everybody fits this criteria. Now, if you're in this criteria, it's a different problem, obviously, than if you just happen to be in a stress reaction. And people can move through the first levels unless there's that genetic, and then they return, because this last level, this brain gets hijacked. Basically, then what happens, you're in a survival mode all the time. Your brain's trying to self-correct, and the only way your brain has to self-correct is to abuse substances, the alcohol, the drugs, whatever it is, right? It can't return to these upper levels, and probably never can go back to casual use, because it's like a diabetic can't sit and eat a Cinnabon with no negative consequences, right? Someone might develop a little bit, eat too much sugar, self-correct. Every once in a while they can have some sugar. It doesn't freak them out. But there's other people that can't. It's just a genetic thing. So when you talk to people, it's, are your eyes blue or brown? Dude, you didn't have a choice in this. It just is. Now you could fake you got different color eyes all you want, right? You could wear colored contacts. Doesn't change what it is. So what we have to do is decide where they fit, because again, you got to fit which category, and really what happens if a person's having a problem, they're having a stress reaction, right? They're going through a divorce, somebody dies, they're coming back from combat, so they're drinking too much, they're acting out, things like that. What happens is, once you get them stable, once you get them clean and sober, do they keep going back and abusing the substance to that level when the stressors are gone? In other words, to me, it is they start finding reasons to use. They get a new job, things settle down, their wife, their spouses, everybody's getting along, and they still go back and drink too much, right? That means maybe their brain's been hijacked, because you have to get sober long enough, clean and sober long enough to get a baseline, right? And so then you have to decide where they fit, have they ever been clean? If they've been clean a long time, then return to it. Well, and then, do they use even when the stressor's relieved? Do they look for reasons to drink or to use? And a big one here would be responsibility. Do they take responsibility? Do they say, I messed up, or it wasn't my fault? Well, if you start deflecting, you know, that's one of those key things for me. Yes, I'm screwing up, Doc. I really need to stop this. You know, and then I just had someone in, and we were talking, and they got, man, I'm really screwing up here. Um, it had to do with losing a lot of money, and they're freaking out, and they're drinking too much, and they're like, man, I'm just, I need some help. I go, have you ever been in treatment? No. Have you ever done this? No. So we worked on some things. We got them calm, got them to stay, they got using stress relief and things like that we'll get into in this program. Because AA, treatment, hypnosis, NLP, a lot of these techniques reset your brain chemicals. So this person learned ways to reset their brain chemicals with meditation, kind of like the meditation, and it's kind of cool, because once he got back to normal, he really didn't want to drink. He was like, it really ain't worth it. So he never did drink. Not that he was, I ran into him, this was a couple years ago. This one was one of the ones when I started reading this and changing how I thought, because I was all or nothing. I asked him, he goes, well, he might go to a party and have half a beer, but he doesn't like it anymore. He's reset his brain. Not everybody can do that, right? But I always say it's best to take a cautious approach and get totally clean. That's why AA is good, right? And you hear some good horror stories in there. And then after a period, see how they respond. That's why you get people that go to AA, and that's why I say, does AA work? When I read the research, I go, they don't get it, because there's many people, they go to AA, they may be real active for a couple years. I see this a lot. Their life gets normal. They kind of quit going to AA. They never drink again. And if they drink, they never get back into, oh my God. They never, which goes against what AA says, right? But actually, when we get into talking about what AA really says, it was meant to be a bridge back to normal living. When you read the old literature, that's what it said. It's kind of become a life unto itself, because it is very, social, gives people something to do, right? But to me, the big question is, why use? If you're happy, why use? Will a beer make anything really happier, right? Yeah, you may like the taste. Okay, I like Diet Dr. Pepper. Am I going to drink 12 of them tonight? I don't think so, right? And again, that would separate the people that, they like a glass of wine with dinner. Well, that makes sense, but why are you drinking 2 bottles, right? Right? So why use? Will drinking make you feel better, enjoy the situation more, relieve stress, right? I know some of the people, the ones that are kind of more spiritually developed would say, those that get clean and sober would say that, there's no situation in my life that a drink will make better. There's no pain that this drug or alcohol will remove. And there's no behavior in my life I need a drink to do. Why would you drink? Right? That's a different way of looking at it, right? So anyway, our job is to decide where they fit. And then in the next thing, we're going to talk more about, abuse, addiction, stress reactions. And then, and how to treat that. Some of it we want just some didactic information so we can talk to the people that we need to talk to. So, but what I'd suggest is watch a couple movies. Leaving Las Vegas, The Hangover, MASH, the movie, not the TV show. A movie called Barfly, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. A recent one was Flight, Bridesmaids, North Dallas 40. But I'd suggest if you take one of these, let's say like The Hangover, where it's funny, all these guys, and if you really step back, is it funny that they get drunk and get a face tattoo? I mean, it's funny to watch someone else do it. If that was your brother, you'd slap him, right? But it's kind of, just think about what that does to the psyche of those, all of us hypnotists and NLPers. When you watch the old movie MASH, I was just watching the other night, how much they drink through it as a stress reaction to the war. And these are the surgeons. These are the best of the best, and they got their martini because it's, wow, kind of interesting, right? But I'd say if you take a funny movie like The Hangover, and then watch a movie, or even like MASH, which is kind of weird, but and then compare it with Flight, the recent Denzel Washington, where he was an addict, it gives you a. It's interesting. It is interesting, right? So watch a couple movies, right, and see how it, and think about what it's doing to the psyche of the people, right? Now, if you're predisposed to alcoholism, you got that genetic quirk, and you see a movie like The Hangover, you think, yeah, it's really funny when you go and you do that kind of stuff, you know? So you think it's funny, right? And it sets that, like, I don't understand why people are getting mad at me, right? And then, as opposed to movies like Flight, which is like, oh my God, this is horrible. So just kind of watch those. It kind of gives you a different format, right? So I'd like to thank you for being on this module. Look for in a couple of days, I'll put up module 2, which will break down abuse, addiction, give you some of the clinical terms. So, if you do talk to the professionals, if you're not really comfortable with it, you'll understand it. Talk a little bit about dual diagnosis, things like that. Not that we necessarily will deal with that, but you need to know what it is. So until next time, have fun.